The gun was already on the table before Tamara Obi walked into the room. She hadn't meant to be there. She hadn't meant to be anywhere near the 43rd floor that Tuesday evening. The cleaning cart's left wheel had been sticking since March, and when it finally caught on the elevator door track, she'd had to wrestle it free with both hands, which was why she was 12 minutes behind schedule, which was why she was still in the East Corridor when the private elevator opened and 6 men in dark coats stepped out without looking at her once. That was the thing about being the night cleaner. People looked right through you. Tamara pressed herself against the supply alcove and watched them pass. She recognized the building, Harlow Tower, Bay Street, Toronto's financial core, because she'd been cleaning it 3 nights a week for the past 2 years. She recognized the floor. 43, the private conference suite that was never booked through the main system and never appeared on the cleaning roster, which was why she was only here now because Dina had called in sick and Tamara had taken the extra route without reading it properly. What she did not recognize were the men, except that one of them, the tall one with the grey at his temples and the kind of posture that came from being obeyed his entire life, stopped just long enough to glance at her cart and then at her face, and whatever he saw there made him turn away without a word. The door to suite 4300 closed behind them. Tamara should have left. She knew it the way you know not to touch a stove. But the cart was already at the end of the corridor, and the supply closet she needed was 3 steps past that door, and she told herself she was just going to get the replacement mop head and go. She told herself that right up until she heard the voices. She didn't speak much French. She didn't need to. She spoke it completely. She also spoke the language the second group was using among themselves in the anteroom. Hungarian, specifically the Budapest dialect with the flattened vowels her grandmother had drilled into her on Sunday afternoons in Etobicoke, and the third language the 1-2 men in the corner were using very quietly and very fast, thinking no one could follow. That was Serbian, and Tamara had spent 18 months in Novi Sad doing contract translation work before her mother got sick and she came home. She should have left. She did not leave. The man with the grey temples was Callaway Steele. This was something Tamara did not know yet, but would. He ran the eastern corridor of the Steele Group's logistics operation, which was a careful way of saying he controlled which goods moved through which ports and which inspectors looked the other way when they did. He was not precisely a criminal in the way films meant the word. He was the kind of man who had lawyers instead of lawyers and accountants instead of records. And if you sat across a table from him in a meeting, you would think he was the most reasonable person you had ever encountered, right up until the moment you understood that every reasonable thing he had said was designed to remove your options. He was 38. He was, by certain objective measures, extraordinarily handsome. He was currently in a great deal of trouble. The trouble was a man named Bela Feher, who had come from Budapest with a delegation of 4 and a translator who, it turned out, had studied Hungarian for 3 years at Ryerson and understood perhaps 60% of what was being said. The other 40% was the part that mattered. Callaway had sent the translator out of the room after the 3rd exchange collapsed into confusion. And now he was sitting at the head of the table with his jaw set, and his hands flat on the polished surface, and the very particular stillness of a man who does not allow himself to show that he is losing. The Feher delegation was not there to negotiate. Tamara understood this within 4 minutes of listening from the anteroom, where she had positioned herself with her cart, blocking the door, and her head tilted at an angle that looked, from the window's reflection, like someone checking inventory. Bela Feher was telling his associate, in Hungarian, quickly, with the confidence of a man who had confirmed no one in the room could understand him, that the numbers Callaway's team had presented were a performance, that they already knew about the Port of Hamilton arrangement, that they had copies of the original agreements and intended to use them not as leverage for renegotiation, but as the basis for a complete takeover of the eastern routes. That the meeting tonight was not a meeting, it was a reading of terms, and the Serbian conversation in the corner, that was 2 members of the Feher security detail telling each other, in the lazy shorthand of men who think they're invisible, exactly where Calloway's second-in-command was going to be at 11 o'clock and what was going to happen there. Tamara stood very still and did the thing she had always done when information arrived faster than she could process it. She sorted, language by language, intention by intention. She had been doing this since she was 9 years old, and her father brought dispatars from 4 different countries and seated them at the same dinner table. And no one but Tamara noticed that 2 of them were negotiating against the other 2. In real time. Right over the jerk chicken, she sorted now. And when she had sorted enough, she understood that the man at the head of the table, whatever he was, whatever his business was, whatever had put a handgun on the conference table beside a glass of water, was 40 minutes away from losing everything, possibly including his second-in-command's life, to people who were never going to honor any agreement they signed tonight. She picked up her mop. She pushed the door open. Every person in the room looked at her. Tamara was 5'4" and she had the kind of body that her Auntie Grace called substantial with love, and her high school gym teacher had called a concern without it. She was wearing the grey uniform with the Harlow Building Services logo on the breast pocket. She had a pen behind one ear and a mop in her hand, and she was by any visible measure the least significant person who had ever entered Suite 4300. One of Feher's men actually laughed. Calloway did not laugh. He looked at her with the precise expression of a man who had been interrupted at the worst possible moment and was deciding whether to have someone remove her immediately or simply wait for her to realize her mistake and retreat. "You need to leave," he said. Very quiet, very final. "Your translator's gone," Tamara said. A beat. "That's not your concern." "The man by the window," Tamara said, and she kept her voice at the same temperature she used when she told residents their recycling was in the wrong bin. Matter of fact, a little tired, not particularly interested in an argument. "Just told his colleague that your associate Renwick is going to be at the parking structure on Richmond at 11. I don't know who Renwick is, but I would call him." The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of confusion, the quiet of recalibration. Bella Feher said something in Hungarian. It was not, Tamara noted, a question. It was an instruction, and it was directed at the 2 men near the window. "He's telling them to confirm what I understood," she said, to no one in particular, and then she looked at Calloway directly for the first time. "I speak Hungarian. I also speak Serbian, and I've been standing in your anteroom for the last 6 minutes." Calloway Steele was very good at stillness. She could see him being very good at it right now. She could also see beneath the stillness a man running numbers. "Sit down," he said finally. "I'd rather stand." Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, the outline of it. "What's your name?" "Tamara Obi. I clean this building 3 nights a week. If you want me to pretend I didn't hear what I heard, I'll need you to tell me what I heard so I know what I'm pretending." Another beat. Longer this time. "Tell me what they said," Calloway said. "All of it," she told him. Not quickly, the way people do when they're frightened. Carefully, the way she'd learned to do in Novi Sad when the clients paid by the word and accuracy was the only thing between her and the door. She separated what had been said in Hungarian from what had been said in Serbian. She noted which statements were instructions and which were observations. She flagged 2 moments where she believed Feher's translator, the one Calloway had dismissed, had rendered accurately, but had failed to convey the register, which changed the meaning significantly. Calloway's second-in-command, a thin, sharp-featured man named Adair, who had been standing near the back wall since she walked in, had his phone out before she finished the first paragraph. One of Feher's men moved toward Tamara. She didn't step back. She looked at him with the same expression she used on the residents, who tried to argue that their pizza boxes were technically recyclable. "I wouldn't," Calloway said, without raising his voice. The man stopped. Feher himself had gone very still. He was watching Tamara with the specific attention of someone recalculating. He was older than she'd expected, early 60s, heavy through the shoulders, with pale eyes that had the quality of a man who had seen people make mistakes and had found it instructive. He said something in Hungarian. Tamara said, without looking away from him. "He wants to know how much I understood," and Calloway said, "Everything." Feher's pale eyes moved to Calloway. He said something short. "He's asking," Tamara said, Whether the building sends spies as cleaners now or whether this is a coincidence, tell him, Calloway said. It's neither. Tamara looked at him. Tell him, Calloway said again, and there was something different in his voice now, something that wasn't instruction, exactly, but was very close to it, that she works for herself. Tamara turned to Feher. She said in Hungarian, clearly and without hurry, she was a contracted cleaner. She had come to collect supplies. She had heard what she heard because no one had thought to check the anteroom, which was a security failure that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the people who planned this meeting. She had no allegiance to anyone in this room. She was telling them what she knew because it seemed on balance like the less dangerous option. Feher listened. He looked at her for a long time, then he laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man encountering something he genuinely had not anticipated, which was, at 62 years old, apparently still possible. He said something that made his associates shift uncomfortably. Tamara translated. He says he's been in this business for 30 years and this is the first time a cleaning woman has conducted a translation he trusts. Adair came back into the room at 9:47. He crossed to Calloway and bent and said something close to his ear. Calloway's expression didn't change. He nodded once. Renwick's safe, he said to Tamara in a low voice. We reached him. Tamara had her mop handle in both hands. She had not sat down. Good, she said. You could have left. I know. Why didn't you? She considered the question. The honest answer was complicated and involved her grandmother and Novi Sad, and 3 years of watching what happened when people with information said nothing. She gave him the shorter version. Because I understood what was happening, she said. It seemed like a waste not to. Something shifted in his expression. Not the outline of amusement this time. The actual thing. Feher interrupted them with a short phrase. Tamara caught it. He wants to know if we're going to restart the negotiation, or if you're going to keep having a private moment at his expense. Calloway looked at her. Tell him we'll restart. I'm not your translator, no. A pause. Are you willing to be, tonight? This meeting. Tamara looked at the table. The gun was still there. She looked at Feher, who was watching her with the pale eyes and the expression of a man who had decided she was, unexpectedly, the most interesting person in the room. She looked at Calloway Steele, who was waiting with the particular quality of stillness she was already learning to read. Not patience, exactly, but the controlled version of urgency. What are you paying? She said. He named a number. It was, she thought, almost enough. She told him so. He named a different number. Fine, Tamara said, and turned to Bella Feher and said in Hungarian that they were ready to proceed. What Tamara understood about negotiation. From Novi Sad, from her father's dinner table, from the 3 years before that, when she'd worked reception at a legal aid clinic on Bloor Street and listened to people who thought the front desk wasn't paying attention, was that most of the information was in the pauses. People learned to control their words. They didn't always learn to control the moment just before the words or the moment just after, when the body responded before the mind could chup. She watched for this all night. Feher's delegation wanted the eastern routes. That was the position. But the pause that came after Calloway's team presented the Hamilton numbers. A half-second of recalibration from one of Feher's associates, a man named Tillman, who sat third from the left and who had the tight jaw of someone processing a surprise, told her something else. They had expected different numbers. Not worse, different. She said nothing about this yet. She translated accurately, completely, and without editorializing. This was important. Both sides had to trust her, and they would only trust her if she gave them reason to, and the only reason she had to give them was precision, so she was precise. Every word, every register, every distinction between what was stated and what was implied. At 10:23, Feher made a proposal that his translator, the Ryerson graduate wherever he was now, would have rendered as a straightforward territorial offer. Tamara translated it as what it actually was, a conditional offer, contingent on a verification process that would take 8 months, and during which Feher's people would have operational access to Calloway's existing infrastructure. She then noted, neutrally, that she was translating the proposal as stated and that she was available to answer any questions about phrasing. Calloway looked at her. She looked back. He said, very quietly, Is there a difference between what he said and what he meant? There's always a difference, Tamara said. I can only tell you what he said. A pause. Tell me what he meant. She glanced at Feher, who was watching this exchange without comprehension. They were speaking in English, which she had established early on as the working language, and Feher's English was present but limited. He meant, Tamara said, still quietly, that 8 months of verification is 8 months of access, and that's worth more to him than whatever the end agreement says. Calloway was still for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to Feher's team and said, in the pleasant, reasonable voice of a man who has just been handed the card he needed, let's talk about a shorter timeline. It was past midnight when the room began to clear. The agreement they reached was not what Feher had come for, which meant it was, by the logic of the evening, something closer to what Calloway had needed. The eastern route stayed intact. The verification timeline was compressed to 6 weeks with a defined scope. Tillman, the associate with the tight jaw, had spent the last hour looking at Tamara with an expression she didn't try to interpret. Adair collected the documents. 2 of Feher's security detail left first. Feher himself paused at the door and said something in Hungarian. Tamara said, he says you have good instincts in hiring. Calloway said, tell him I didn't hire her. She was already here. She translated. Feher laughed again, the same genuine laugh, and then he was gone, and the door closed, and Tamara was standing in Suite 4300 with a mop she hadn't used, and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been translating under pressure for 3 hours. She turned to retrieve her cart. Tamara. She stopped. She hadn't heard him use her first name before. He'd said Ms. Obi twice during the meeting, in the formal moments. Tamara just then sounded different. We're going to need a debrief, Calloway said. He was gathering papers. He wasn't looking at her, but she had the sense that he was very aware of where she was in the room. Not tonight. Tomorrow, if you're available. There are things I need to know about what you heard in the anteroom. Details we didn't cover. I have another building to clean in the morning, she said. He looked up. I have a job, Tamara said. I'll need the morning covered. He said nothing for a moment. I'll arrange it, he said, and the rate from tonight stays for the debrief. The rate from tonight, Calloway said, was an opening offer. We can discuss adjustments tomorrow. We can discuss them now. He looked at her across the table. The gun was gone. Adair had taken it quietly an hour ago. What remained was the table and the skyline through the glass and the particular quality of a room that had been under pressure and was now slowly releasing it. Tomorrow, he said, and it wasn't an argument. It was something else. Tamara picked up her cart. Tomorrow, she agreed and pushed the door open and went back to the corridor where the evening had been entirely ordinary until it wasn't. She saw him the next morning in a boardroom on a different floor, a normal floor, with normal light and a coffee service as on a credenza and a view of the lake that was almost aggressively Canadian in its beauty. Adair was there. 2 other people she didn't know. A woman named Brennan who was, Tamara understood within 4 minutes, the person who actually kept the operation from collapsing. She had the quality of supreme competence that gets mistaken for quietness. Calloway was already seated when Tamara arrived. He stood up when she walked in. She noticed that. She filed it. The debrief ran 2.5 hours. Tamara gave them everything she'd heard in the anteroom in the order she'd heard it, with timestamps approximated and language of origin noted. Adair took notes on a laptop. Brennan asked 3 questions, all of them surgical. Calloway mostly listened, and she understood, watching him listen, that this was how he operated. He absorbed information with the patience of someone who would decide what to do with it later, after the other people in the room had shown him everything they knew. At 11:40, Brennan closed her notebook and said, "She's better than the last 3. This was addressed to Calloway and was not about Tamara's feelings, but it was, Tamara understood, a significant statement. "I know," Calloway said. Tamara said, "I'm sitting here." Brennan looked at her directly for the first time. Something adjusted in her expression, not an apology, but an acknowledgement. "You are," Brennan said. "My point stands." At the end of the meeting, when the others had left, Calloway set an envelope on the table in front of Tamara. She looked at it. She didn't pick it up yet. "This is for last night," he said, "and a retainer if you're interested. Ongoing work. Nothing like last night, necessarily." translation, review, some travel possibly. I have 3 buildings, Tamara said. Tuesdays and Thursdays, Harlow and the Dundas property. Mondays and Fridays, the King Street complex. I'm aware. She looked at him. Brennan ran a background check this morning, he said without apology. Standard. What did you find? 18 months in Novi Sad, translation and interpretation services, commercial and legal. Before that, 3 years legal aid, Bloor Street. Before that, University of Toronto, linguistics and applied language studies, graduated with distinction. A pause. You left a PhD program. Tamara picked up the envelope. My mother got sick. He didn't say anything. She's fine now, Tamara said. She's been fine for 2 years. I just never went back. Why not? She considered the question. The honest answer was complicated and involved the way returning to something felt like admitting the interruption had mattered. The shorter version was simpler. I liked the work, she said. The cleaning. You see things. People don't look at you. A pause. I looked at you. You looked at my cart, Tamara said. In the corridor. Then you looked away. He was quiet. Last night was the first time, she said. Anion in that building looked at my face. The silence was the honest kind, not uncomfortable exactly, but substantial. The kind that meant something was being considered carefully. The retainer, Calloway said finally. Think about it. You don't have to answer today. Tamara put the envelope in her bag. She stood up. I'll answer Thursday, she said, when I'm in the building. He almost smiled. Thursday then. She said yes on Thursday. Not because the money was transformative, though it was. Not because she was tired of the cart and the corridors, though some nights she was. She said yes because she was good at the work in a way that mattered, and because she had spent 3 years being invisible in buildings where everything important happened, and she was tired of invisible. What followed was not simple. The Feher situation had implications she spent the next 2 months helping to untangle. Calls at odd hours, documents in 3 languages. One afternoon in a windowless room with a lawyer from Montreal who kept looking at her like he was trying to understand how she'd arrived in this conversation. She had to explain herself 4 times in the first month to people who assumed Calloway had made a sentimental error. She didn't explain herself a 5th time. By the 2nd month, no one was asking. Brennan, who was efficient with everything including her regard, told her in week 6 that she was the most useful person Calloway had brought in since Adair, and this was apparently high praise, because Adair had been with Calloway for 9 years and would, Brennan implied, probably be with him until one or both of them was retired or dead. Calloway himself said very little about her competence directly. He was not a man who narrated his own conclusions. But she noticed that when she was in a room, his attention organized itself around her input in a way that was specific and consistent, and she noticed that he had stopped by week 3, looking past her when he was looking at her. She noticed these things because she paid attention. It was, she had always believed, the most portable skill she had. The Feher situation came back in March. Tillman, the associate with the tight jaw, the one who had sat 3rd from the left and processed a surprise in October, reappeared with a separate approach and a separate proposal. He came through a 3rd party, a property group in Mississauga, and he was careful and patient about it. And if Tamara had not been in the room when the Mississauga contact made his pitch, she might not have caught the specific phrase that Tillman had used in Hungarian 6 months earlier in Suite 4300. But she had been in that room, and she caught it. She told Calloway that evening. They were in his office, a different room, smaller, with books she'd noticed he actually read, and she laid out the connection methodically, the way she laid out everything. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was what he did when something mattered. When she finished, he said, "You remembered a phrase from 6 months ago." "I remember everything I translate," she said. "It's the job. It's not just the job." She looked at him. "It's you," he said, which was as direct as he usually got about anything that wasn't logistics. There was a pause, the kind that meant something was being considered. "The Mississauga meeting," she said. "You'll want me there." "I want you everywhere," Calloway said, and then the quality of the silence changed in a way that told her he'd heard himself. He looked at her steadily, which was, she had learned, how he looked at things he'd decided. "I mean that professionally," he said. "I know," Tamara said. "And otherwise," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "One thing at a time," she said. "Mississauga first." He nodded. But he was almost smiling again, and she was beginning to understand that almost smiling was for Calloway Steele a significant expression. The Mississauga meeting happened on a Thursday. Tillman arrived with 2 associates and a new translator, and the settled confidence of a man who believed he was operating on information his counterpart didn't have. Tamara sat at the table this time. Not with a cart, not in a corridor, but at the table, with a glass of water and a notepad and a clarity about her role that nobody in the room questioned, because Calloway had introduced her by name and by function, and with the particular quality of certainty that closed questions before they opened. It took Tillman 11 minutes to understand the situation. She watched the recalibration happen in real time. The tight jaw, the flicker of something behind the eyes. He said in Hungarian to his associate, she was the woman from the meeting in October. His associate said yes. He said in Hungarian that this was going to be more complicated than they'd planned. Tamara translated all of this, calmly and completely. Tillman looked at her. She looked back. "Perhaps," he said, in careful English, "we should start again." "That," Tamara said, "seems like the right instinct." She still cleaned buildings sometimes. Not for Harlow Building Services, she'd left that in January, but occasionally in the way you keep a thing that's part of how you understand yourself. She had a friend, Dina, who still ran that route, and sometimes on a Tuesday she would help out for a few hours and push the cart with the sticking wheel through corridors where no one looked at her face. She didn't mind it. She had never minded it. She had minded, sometimes, the assumption underneath, that invisible was the same as unimportant, that quiet was the same as absent, that the person with the mop was not the person with the information. But she'd always known the difference. That was the thing. She'd always known. It just took one night on the 43rd floor for anyone else to find out. Calloway told her once, it was a Tuesday in April, the lake still grey with the last of winter, that the thing that had made him trust her from the very first moment was not the languages. Plenty of people had languages. It was the fact that she had not been frightened. She had walked into that room with a mop in her hand, and she had not been frightened of what she knew. Tamara thought about that for a long time. "I was a little frightened," she told him honestly. "I know," he said. "You didn't let it move you." She looked at the lake. The grey was starting to lift the way it did in Toronto in early spring, reluctantly, as if the cold had been comfortable and saw no reason to leave. "That's the job," she said. "Knowing what's in the room. Not letting it decide what you do next." Calloway looked at her the way he looked at things he'd decided. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it.